how does a more reliable network help to improve security overall? When you talk about that management component, obviously the bug fixes can kind of come from the perspective of keeping it clean. But what are some of the ways that if we're trying to just day by day improve how we're doing, say, network management, which is the focus here, what is the type of impact that can have on security, understanding that security or cybersecurity is probably the most critical technology concern for almost every organization?
Yeah, this is a big topic, Saeed. So let me break that apart a little bit because I think part of it is the network infrastructure itself. Part of it is the network security we enable. Um, Part of it is, the visibility and the interaction or the integration with the other tools to overall reduce risk in an organization, right?
Mm,
It's one thing to go chase down all these issues, but can we fundamentally reduce the amount of risk so there's not as many things that we have to chase? And the things
mhm,
that we have to chase, the blast radius of that is as small as possible.
mhm,
But let's start, simple, Saeed. One, we kind of talked about how we roll out patches and roll out vulnerability fixes, et cetera, at scale, right? People
mhm,
shouldn't have to worry about, hey, I've got to patch up my infrastructure of 1,000 switches and 2,000 APs, and how long is that going to take? And can I take it on? And how big is the risk? And is it worth it or not worth it? And, can I do it in a day, or is it going to take me the whole summer? And how does that, increase my risk? That's a challenge, right? In today's world with all these different disparate systems. That should just happen behind the scenes, right? So that
mhm,
issue fundamentally goes away. Number two is if you think about, and I'm sure a lot of your customers or the audience, especially in higher ed and K through 12, a lot of these folks are budget strapped. A lot of these folks tend to want to get the maximum life out of the investment or the hardware that they're purchasing. What that typically leads to is stuff going end of life, end of sale, end of development, which means
mhm,
I can't get vulnerability fixes for. I can't get patches for anymore, right? And if I can't get patches for, I now have a risk that's there that I've got to try to accommodate some other way. I might be saving cost over here, but it's going to hit me somewhere else, right? And we've seen, the trend of cyber insurance premiums go up and down, but as of like a year and a half ago or so, I heard from universities that those premiums were going up 100% to 400% year over year
mm,
if you could get coverage, because the list of requirements went up from one page of loosely written requirements about 5 or so years ago to 40 pages of very detailed requirements lately, right?
mhm,
So if I can't patch my systems, guess what? That's a risk. My premium goes up. And it's just like, okay, am I really saving money in this organization? And I'm also exposing risk in my organization.
yeah,
We had a couple of customers that, one thing they love about an as a service type model is there is no end of life. There is no refresh cycle, right? Amazon doesn't tell you when they end of life a server, right? It just goes away and there's a new server there and it's transparent to you and the end of life problem goes away,
mhm,
right? And that even goes with new capabilities, right? So that's number two. Number three is kind of what I'm alluding to on this slide, Saeed, and that's the security that is built into the network itself. If you think about networks today, and by the way, I think fundamentally that securing a network is the poster child of complexity that
mhm,
we've been talking about so far on this call. I've done it for a long time and it's very, very complex. And for that reason, a lot of folks trade off that complexity with risk. How many environments are you still walking into where the wired port is wide open? It's mapped to a VLAN. I can plug in anywhere and I'm going to get some type of access,
mhm,
right? The reason for that is pure complexity and cost, right? And the other reason for that is because a lot of security is bolt on and you have to configure it. A switch that you take out of box, there's no security inherently, turned on. You have to first go configure security on that console port to try to lock down config access to that box. Then you
mm,
got to try to figure out how to go lock down the wired ports to handle all the different types of users and devices that are going to connect to that with multiple different types of authentication schemes. Do the same for wireless. Then you got to figure out your segmentation strategy and figure out what VLANs you're going to use. And then you got to figure out where am I going to trunk those VLANs to what firewall? What kind of policies am I going to build on the firewall? And is it going to be zone-based, subnet-based, user ID-based? And how do those integrations work? And then most organizations take a stance of assume compromise, Saeed, because you can't prevent everything, which
Mhm.
means now I've got to figure out where am I going to tap and what detection tools am I going to put in there to try to find attacker behaviors, hopefully early enough in the kill chain, way before it becomes a breach. That's the complexity story of trying to lock down the network,
Mhm.
right? Again, there's a lot of trade-offs and compromises that go, you know, inside of that in most organizations. But what if you could just consume security? What if you didn't have to bolt it on? What if the network was already inherently insecure and frankly more secure than you could ever make it? Right? If you could consume security without worrying about the complexity and the cost of it, and it was just turned on and it enhanced your existing security tools like your firewall and your other detection tools, that could dramatically lower your risk in your organization, which could dramatically reduce the insurance premiums, and coming back to your original question, dramatically reduce the amount of time and effort it takes for the security teams to go chase down stuff.
Mm.
And what I mean by that, just at a very high level, we basically implemented something called Campus Zero Trust, right? And this is what I mean by consuming security. We took zero trust principles and built it into the campus network, which is not a paradigm that exists in any networking vendor today. We basically said, hey, everything's got to be end-to-end encrypted by default. Everything's got to, we can't allow any unauthorized connections, and we have to enforce every request or every flow. Those are some core zero trust principles. The network stack comes up and does that by default. It essentially becomes an extension of your firewall. What if every host was isolated from every other host by default, and the firewall had the ability to see every flow from every host, and then had the ability to detect behaviors in it that were malicious and prevent those flows from even happening? Like the first thing that a compromised host is going to do when it comes into a network, it's going to figure out where else can I laterally spread. So it's going to do a host scan, a port scan, figure out what other hosts on my VLAN I can actually spread to establish persistence elsewhere. Guess what? Nature of switching, normal switching, all of that stuff will happen at the access switch with inside the VLAN. The firewall, your security tools don't see any of it. That
Mm.
means the blast radius becomes bigger than it needs to be, which makes the efforts of the security teams that you were talking about earlier that much greater to figure out where all has this spread and how do I clean this up.